So today I'm going to show you how to make this morphing tile effect entirely in Blender. And this is a pretty easy effect to make, but there are a couple things you need to make sure you know before starting. First of all, you need to be familiar with camera tracking inside Blender. And if you need a refresher, I have a 2-part tutorial series just on camera tracking. So make sure you're confident with that, and also you need to know about projection painting. And of course, I also have some tutorials that cover projection painting. So from this point on, I'm going to assume you know about all these things and you're ready to learn how to make this. So the overall workflow for making this effect is only 5 steps. The first thing we're going to do is convert our video into an image sequence. We can then camera track that sequence and try to get a low reprojection error on that track. Then we're going to set up some geometry and use projection painting to texture it. And once we've done that, we're then going to divide our geometry into tiles and animate them using drivers. And finally, we're just going to do a bit of compositing to tie everything together. So let's hop into Blender and get started. So the first thing I want to do is demonstrate how we're going to animate these tiles. So let's add in a plane that will act as our tile, and I'm also going to add an empty and put that above our plane. And generally what we want is our plane to always be facing this empty no matter where we move it. To do this, select the plane and go to the Constraints tab, and then you just want to add in a damp track constraint where our empty is the target and change the mode to Z. And this does exactly what we wanted, but to make it look nicer, we're going to need some fall off. So ideally, the further away the empty is, the less influence it will have on the plane. So in the influence value, we're going to add in a driver, and we want this to be inversely proportional to the distance between these two objects. So I'm just going to rename our variable and set it to the distance type. And for the two objects, we're going to choose the empty and the plane. So right now, our variable is just storing the distance between the origins of these two objects. And since we want an inverse relationship, what we're going to do for the expression is set it to the reciprocal of our distance. So as the distance grows larger, the influence will shrink to 0. And this already looks much nicer than what we had before. But still, the setup doesn't give us that much control. So in the object tab of our empty, we're going to add a new custom property, and I'm going to call it scale factor. And what we want this to control is the strength of the expression we put in our driver. And to add this into our expression, we're going to need the data path of this property, so just right click and copy the data path. And then we're going to go back to our plane and edit the driver. So I'm just going to add a new variable called scale factor and set our object to the empty and paste in our data path. And to modify our expression, we're going to multiply it by the scale factor. And we can see this works because when we bring our slider down, the influence wears off. So now all we need to do is extend this idea to multiple tiles. So let's scale up our plane and add in some loop cuts to define our tiles. And we can separate these faces using an edge split so they're no longer connected, and then separate them into distinct objects by separating by loose parts. And right now if we move our empty, they're still all acting like one plane. But this is just because they still all have the same origin. So the last thing we need to do is select all of them and then set our origin to geometry. And just like that, we get this morphing tile effect that is dependent on the location of the empty and the value of the scale factor. And this is the exact idea we're going to be using when dealing with our footage. So now let's actually create the real thing. So the first thing we need to do is convert our video into an image sequence because that's nicer for tracking. And to do this, head over to the video editing workspace and add in the footage you want to work with. And everything is playing nicely, but we don't need this whole movie clip. I'm going to find the first frame where we'd like to start off and then copy the current frame number into the project start point. And then do the same type of thing with the end point. And effectively, by changing our project in and out, we're trimming our footage. And once you're happy with that, there are a couple more things we need to deal with. So go to the render tab and under color management, set your view transform to default. And this just prevents Blender from changing the color of our footage. Next, we're going to go to the output tab and set this to export out as a JPEG sequence at maximum quality and just create a folder for that. And at this point, if you hit Ctrl F12 to render out this animation, it will work, but you may get some frames skipped or get some glitchy frames. And to make sure this doesn't happen, I'm going to mess with the proxy and timecode settings. So enable the proxy and timecode checkbox, and we're then going to choose the 100% proxy at maximum quality, and for the timecode index, choose record run. And once all that's ready, we can hit rebuild proxy and timecode indices. And basically, this just forces Blender to go frame by frame in order and prevents all sorts of glitches you may run into. So now I'm going to hit Ctrl F12 to render out this animation. So now that we're done rendering, I'm going to create a new Blender project and head over to the movie clip editor so we can begin tracking. So just import in your image sequence, and just like last time, we need to head over to the render tab, and under color management, we're going to change the view transform to default. And since we're dealing with image sequences, we can choose any frame rate we want. So head over to the output tab, and I'm just going to choose 30 frames per second. And at this point, I begin the camera tracking process. Now, since this isn't a tracking tutorial and it takes a long time to track, I'm going to really speed through this part. And if you want to see this whole process, I'm going to add it to the end of the video so you can really watch it in full. Generally, I'm just trying to find enough features so we have 8 active trackers throughout the whole shot. Make sure that when you do your solve, you have Blender calculate the K1 and K2 distortions. We're going to need this information about the lens distortion later on. And once we get an initial solve, the goal is to bring the reprojection error down as low as we can make it. And the 3 biggest tricks to do this are deleting bad trackers, trimming off any bad frames, and lowering the weights of high error trackers. And I end up getting a solve error of around 0.55, which is pretty good, and now we can begin setting up our scene. So in the 3D viewport, select everything and delete it, and then hit Setup Tracking Scene. And when we look through the camera view, everything looks misaligned, but of course this is just an issue of orientation. So all we need to do is select 3 trackers that are on the ground, and then hit Floor. We can then also specify an origin and a y-axis. And for the rest of this, we're just going to adjust the orientation manually. So while our camera is selected, I'm going to move it along the y-axis until the origin is just touching the wall. And we're going to rotate the camera about the z-axis until our x-axis, that's the red line, perfectly goes along the bottom of the wall. And this is the type of thing that takes lots of refinement. So just keep moving the origin and rotating about the z-axis until you've gotten it as good as you can make it. The better you do this, the better the final result will look. And for the majority of the shot, our red line is now pretty flush with the wall, and now we're ready to move on to the next step. So before we begin adding our geometry and projection painting, we need to make sure we're projecting undistorted images. And basically this means we need to remove the lens distortion from our sequence. So to do this, head over to the compositing workspace, and you're going to see we already have this initial node set up. And this graph was created for us when we hit Setup Tracking Scene before. Now we only want to undistort our sequence, so I'm going to delete most of these nodes and then connect our undistort node to the viewer and the composite. And you can see that this setup does exactly what we want. So now go to the Output tab and set this to export out as a JPEG sequence at maximum quality and create a new folder for that. And once that's all set up, just hit Ctrl F12 to render out this animation. And right now what we're doing is rendering out the undistorted version of our sequence, which we can use for projection painting. So now let's set up some geometry to match the wall and the floor. I'm going to add a plane, and then in edit mode, bring this edge to the very bottom. And now of course we want to extrude this up along the z-axis to match our wall. And now what you want to do is extend this geometry so it's taking up the whole frame, and extend it to the left and the right. Especially we want to make sure that this is taking up the whole floor so we don't need to hide any seams later on. And this is looking pretty good throughout our shot, and this is the geometry we want to turn into tiles. So we're just going to add a couple loop cuts to both faces and make sure those tiles look like squares. And now that our geometry is set up, we can begin projection painting. So head over to the UV editing workspace, and what we need to do is unwrap this mesh. And the easiest way to do this is to add a seam between our 2 planes and then hit U for unwrap. And to make sure we're optimizing our UV space, I'm just going to scale these 2 islands along the x-axis. And because we stretched this out, we're going to end up extracting a stretched out texture when projection painting. But that doesn't really matter for what we're doing here. And obviously for projection painting, we're going to need to add a second UV map, and on that map, just do a project from view on the first frame. So now in the texture paint workspace, we're going to change our mode to single image and then create a new image with a convenient name where we'll store our texture. And for this, we're going to need to choose a very high resolution like 3500 by 3500. And we're going to want to paint onto our original UV map. And then to set up our projection brush, choose clone brush and then enable clone from paint slot set to our project UV map. And again, we're going to want to project our undistorted images, so just import those in by disabling detect sequences and then just select them all. Now since we did our project from view on the first frame, we're going to want to use the first undistorted frame as our source. And when we start projection painting, you see that everything is working perfectly. But of course we want to cover the whole wall, so we're going to need to go to a new frame and repeat the process. So again, on your project UV map, run another project from view, and then in the texture paint workspace, update your source image and then keep painting. And basically we're just going to to keep repeating this process all the way down the wall, and we're going to need to go back and forth to fill in any patches. And really what we're doing here is just painting our geometry using different projections from different points in the shot. And once we're done with that, you're going to see we still have some areas we need to fill in, and we can use the clone brush to do that. So disable clone from paint slot, and to use the clone brush, just control click to sample the texture and then paint like normal. And we're going to do our best to fill in the floor, but there's no way to fix the wall because it has a unique graffiti design. So using the clone brush in this case just wouldn't look right. And again, if you want to see this whole process slow down, I'm going to put it at the end of the video so you can watch it in full. So now that we're done projection painting, you see the geometry blends pretty well into the shot. And what we want to do is apply this new texture as a material to our geometry. So head over to the shading workspace and create a new material. And instead of the principled BSDF, we're going to add in our image texture we created before and put a diffuse BSDF in between. And this just lets us have our texture and also lighting effects like shadows if we want them later on. So now that we have everything textured, we want to set up our tiles. So just like I showed before, we're going to add an empty and bring that up. And then in the constraints tab of our geometry, we're going to add a damp track with the empty as the target set to Z. And you can see that this is now facing the empty, but of course we want some fall off. So again, we're going to add a driver to the influence and define a distance variable that measures the distance between the geometry and the empty. And for the expression, we're going to use the reciprocal of the variable. So as the distance grows larger, the influence is going to shrink to 0. And to give us some more control, we're going to go to the object tab of our empty and add a custom property called factor. You then want to copy this data path, and then back in the driver, we're going to define a new variable set to our empty and paste in the data path. And finally, to modify our expression, we're just going to multiply it by our factor. So now that we have our setup ready, I'm going to set our factor to 0 so everything levels out. And just like before, to create our tiles, we're going to run an edge split and then separate by loose parts. And to make sure that every tile acts independently, we're going to set our origin to geometry for all these tiles. And when we bring our factor back up, you see we've made a very modular setup and the textures are sticking on like they're supposed to. So now I just want to animate some kind of flight path for our empty. So on the first frame, we're going to add a location keyframe with I, and then on the last frame, we're just going to move it across and add another keyframe. And to make this more of a sweeping path, we're just going to go somewhere in between and then change the location and add another keyframe. So now we have a nice looking path and we just want to animate our factor value. So on the first frame, I'm going to hover over the slider and hit I to add a keyframe. And somewhere around frame 60, we want our morphing to be more powerful, so I'll change the value to 0.15 and add another keyframe. And I'm going to have it maintain that factor up until around frame 120. And then finally on the last frame, I'm going to set it back to 0. So now we have our morphing tile effect animated, and we just need to blend this in with our sequence. So to do this, all we have to do is select all the border tiles and deselect any objects we might have accidentally picked up. And then to make this look more interesting, I'm going to select some random tiles in between. So just pick any of them that you want frozen from both the wall and the floor. And once we've completed the selection, all we have to do is join them and delete the constraints so they don't move. And now our morphing tile effect is sweeping across but ignoring the frozen tiles. The next thing we need to do is put something behind our geometry so our sequence isn't shown in the background. And the easiest way to do this is just to duplicate one of the tiles and extrude it downwards. We're then going to have the sweep all the way down the x-axis and then down the y-axis, and we also want this to be behind our wall. And once you're happy with the positioning, we're just going to delete the interfaces so we have a hollow object and then remove the constraint. And the look I'm going for is some sort of void behind these tiles. And to do that, just go over to the shading workspace and hit this button to unlink our material from the rest. And I'm just going to leave this node graph empty, so by default the whole mesh turns black. So now when we play through our animation, you see that we have this black void behind our tiles. And now what we need to do is set up everything for rendering. So I'm going to switch to the Cycles render engine because it's more physically accurate than Eevee. And we can bring down the render samples and also disable hair and motion blur. Now we're going to go to the rendered view and reposition our light so it's more in the middle of the geometry. And to brighten the scene, we're just going to go to the light settings and enable use nodes so we can bring our emission up. And at this point, we don't know if everything is too bright or too dark because we have this gray background. So to get rid of that, go to the Render tab and under Film, enable Transparent. So now we can just keep messing with our emission value until the geometry is roughly as bright as the background. And when we're trying to match these, you do want to reference different frames in the sequence so we can get the best match possible. And this doesn't need to be perfect or anything, so when you're happy with that, we're just going to disable background images in the Camera tab. And now we're ready to composite everything together. So head over to the compositing workspace and we're going to add a render layers node and overlay that with our undistorted footage using an alpha over node. So right now what this does is overlay the tile setup over the undistorted sequence. And something to notice is that both the render layers node and the undistorted sequence are undistorted inputs. So if we want to add our distortion back, all we have to do is copy over this node set to distort and hook up our alpha over node. And we're going to feed this into both the viewer and the composite node, and then in the layout workspace, we're just going to find a nice looking frame and render out with F12. And now that this is done rendering, you see it's applied our composite, but we still need to blend the foreground and the background better. And to do this, we're just going to feed the alpha from the render layers node into the alpha over node. And we're going to modify this using a dilate/erode node. And what you're seeing in the viewer now is essentially the mask where the foreground is going to be applied. So ideally, we just want to blur the edges of this to blend everything together better. And this is the reason we froze those border tiles before. We can now eat into those without affecting our animation. So to add in this blur, just set the mode to feather and then choose some negative distance until everything is looking right. And now when we look at our final output, the foreground and the background are blended together. So this is what it looks like before and then after. So now that we're done compositing, I'm just going to set this to export out as a JPEG sequence at maximum quality and create a new folder for this render. And now finally, we can hit Ctrl F12 to render out this animation. And that's how you make the morphing tile effect. I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful and you learned something. Stick around to the end of this video if you want to see the complete tracking and painting process, but otherwise, thank you guys for watching.